Hello, I'm really glad you're here. On this channel, I share simple, quiet stories about life, love, and the little feelings we all go through. If that sounds like something you enjoy, don't forget to subscribe. Every subscriber gives me a little more encouragement to keep telling these stories. Now, let's begin today's story. A Texas summer noon weighed heavy, like a wet blanket thrown over the city. Heat shimmered up from the asphalt, bending every line, making the far-off buildings quiver in the air. From the window of his third-floor apartment in Houston, David looked down at the sun-speckled parking lot, hearing the cicadas rasp hoarsely in the swelter. The TV was already tuned to the local news. Satellite images spun, showing a white swirl creeping toward the coastline along the bottom of the screen. A red ticker scrolled voluntary evacuation in effect, upgrade expected. The anchor's voice stayed even, trying for calm, but it tightened around the last few words. Ethan wandered out from the bedroom, t-shirt plastered to his back with sweat. He opened the fridge, digging for the coldest soda can. The rattle of aluminum crisp in the air, the chill from the fridge hit his face, making him shiver in delight.
You sure we don't need to stock up on more stuff? People are going crazy for bottled water.
If we stay, we'd need a generator and we don't have one. If the power's out for long, the elevator's dead, and we're stuck here. I'm not risking that.
David picked up the remote, turning up the volume. The radar zoomed in, the storm bands curling tight like a clenched fist. The anchor talked about wind gusts topping 100 miles per hour. He started running through plans in his head the way he used to as a field engineer for a power company. Which route, how much gas, which streets would flood first. The phone on the table buzzed hard. The screen lit up Houston EM, Valdez. David answered, pressing it to his ear like every word mattered.
Mr. Harper, this is Officer Valdez from Emergency Management. Latest forecast says Felicity could be a strong hurricane at landfall. We recommend leaving the city within the next 2 hours. Parts of I-45 will close intermittently for evacuation.
Copy that. Is my neighborhood in the flood zone?
High risk. Drainage will overload if the rain concentrates. Best to move now. Remember, fill your tank. Bring documents, medications, and tell someone where you're headed.
Thanks, Officer Valdez.
The call ended, leaving a strange, hollow quiet. The wall clock ticked like it had picked up speed. David set the phone down, fingers tapping the table, eyes on the old backpack under the chair.
Ethan, pack for 2 days. Chargers, cables, clothes, shoes. We're leaving now.
Where?
Claymore.
The town's name seemed to fall into the heat like a stone into still water. Ethan blinked. He knew it was where his grandfather lived, a place familiar from a few old photos, but as far away as a blur on a map.
Is the road even open? I heard I-45 might close.
There's a back route through the country roads. If we leave now, we'll beat the flood in Claymore. Your granddad knows how to board windows, store water. He's ridden out storms his whole life.
David went to the bedroom, pulling a suitcase from under the bed. He tossed in shirts, jeans, socks, then stopped when his hand found his old denim jacket, sun-bleached, salt-worn. His fingers traced the frayed cuff, and a flash of memory hit Claymore's backyard. Weathered posts, Frank's rough hand on his shoulder, the short command, "Grab the hammer." He shook his head, shoved the jacket in, on the shelf. A photo of Ethan at 10 baseball cap, grinning in the sun. Beside it, a frame face down. David hesitated, then flipped it over, a black and white of him in the middle. Frank to the left, Martha on the right. His mother smiled softly, hand on her husband's arm. Behind them, the sky held storm clouds like dark mountains. His throat went dry. He put the frame back, face down, zipped the suitcase hard.
Dad, where's the flashlight? We got AA batteries.
Second kitchen drawer. Grab the first aid kit too, and put all our IDs in your bag: passport, license, insurance.
Ethan's footsteps pattered across the wood floor. He pulled a handful of batteries, 2 vanilla-scented candles from last Christmas, and a box of matches. He looked around the little kitchen laminate cabinets. Small counter, and realized this was the first time he'd had to leave home for a real storm. Out in the hallway, feet rushed by. Someone shouted to bring in the flower pots. The smell of hot plastic mixed with warm metal. A neighbor knocked Lorraine, hair curled, holding a pet carrier with a meowing cat.
You leaving? I'm heading to my sister's in Katy. Don't take I-45, they'll close part of it. Lord, another hurricane season.
We're going to Claymore. Make sure you fill up.
Will do. Hey, Ethan, take care. Here, kid.
Bye, Ms. Lorraine.
The door shut, leaving just the TV and the clock. David scribbled a quick list on a sticky note: meds, chargers, water, canned food, raincoats, gas can. He pulled down painkillers and allergy meds, zipped them in a bag. From the pantry, he grabbed beef jerky, energy bars, 2 loaves of bread, peanut butter. Ethan staggered in with a 6-liter case of water, setting it by the door, sweat trailing down his temple.
Should I call Aunt Karen?
I'll do it. Check your phone's charged and download offline maps.
He dialed his sister, 3 rings.
You've heard, right, God? Houston again.
You should head to Dallas. We're driving to Claymore.
To Frank's, you sure?
Back roads are still clear, less flooding there. If we get stuck here without the elevator, we're done.
Fine. Text me when you get there. And, David, if you see him.
I'll call you later. We have to go.
He hung up, heart beating in a different rhythm, the uneasy pulse of heading straight toward a past he'd dodged. Outside, sunlight had shifted from bright to glaring pale. Lead-colored clouds crept in like chess pieces taking the board. David grabbed toiletries from the bathroom razor, mouthwash, travel toothpaste, tossing them into a bag. In the mirror, a 45-year-old man stared back. Faint shadows under the eyes, jaw set. He tried a smile. His face didn't follow. Ethan leaned on the doorway, hesitating.
Can I ride shotgun?
Yeah, you watch the map.
Got it.
He turned away, swallowing the question about his grandfather. The last time he'd been to Claymore, he was 10. Frank had towered like a fence post, skin weathered, hands rough but warm. He'd set a baseball cap on Ethan's head and said, "Fitz." It was a lone, shining memory. Passing through the living room, David's gaze snagged on the face-down photo. He picked it up for a second, caught his mother's quiet smile, felt his chest tighten. He set it back, whispering under his breath, "Not now." Wind on the balcony kicked up, whipping the curtain, knocking over a potted cactus. Ethan scooped it up, brushing dirt off outside. Leaves from the hackberry trees spun like tiny propellers.
I hear thunder. No rain yet.
Storm's not here, but its front's already hitting. Let's move.
They rolled their bags to the door. David took one last glance at the apartment. The old sofa. Coffee table with scratches. 2 cup sweating rings onto wood. Ethan's baseball cap hanging on a hook. Everything so ordinary it felt strange to be leaving it in a rush. The hallway was crowded. A man taped X's on his windows. A couple with backpacks led a trembling dog in a yellow raincoat. The air reeked of rain gear and takeout. The elevator kept overloading. David steered Ethan to the stairs, heat pooling like an oven as they descended. At the first floor, the metal door swung open to a blast of hairdryer heat. In the parking lot, engines idled, AC units hummed. David unlocked his grey pickup, tossed the bags in the bed, slid the cover shut. Ethan climbed into the passenger seat, buckling in, pulling up maps on his phone. David checked the spare gas can under the seat, then looked up. Clouds layered thick, horizons smudged dark. The flag outside the building office snapped in the wind. He started the engine. It growled, then smoothed. He rested his hand on the gear shift, hesitating. He glanced at Ethan, almost saying, "Don't worry." But it felt false.
You bring your allergy meds.
Yeah, and bandages.
Good, we'll fill up at the corner station.
They rolled past the security booth. The guard waved wearily. Streets were busier than usual, SUVs loaded with bags, cases of water, hoods scrawled in chalk out. North, by Felicity. At a red light, David watched plumeria trees bend hard in the wind. A flyer tumbled down the street, chasing a plastic bag like two hawks in the same current.
Dad, why not just stay in the city shelter?
When the water rises, those places pack tight. Illness spreads fast. Claymore's got fewer people. Frank's got tools, wood, oil lamps. He knows storms.
He okay?
He'll be fine.
The words came quicker than David intended, a kind of self-reassurance. He gripped the wheel. Frank's broad shoulders flashed in his mind, the curt nod that passed for hello. Felicity was pushing him toward a place he'd avoided for years. The light turned green. David pulled into the gas station. Lines of cars coiled like snakes. Heat shimmered, smelling of fuel, rubber, sweat. The sign flickered prices up a few cents since morning. He shut off the truck, rolled the window halfway to vent the heat. Ethan zoomed in on his phone map, a red warning dot on I-45. He traced a detour through FM 517 and back roads.
This way avoids the jam, but it's low in places.
If we go now, we'll beat the rain. Claymore's on high ground.
A spot opened at the pump. David pulled forward, stepped out, sweat breaking instantly. He pumped gas. Watching the numbers race, Ethan came back from the store with water and cold wipes. The young cashier with a swallow tattoo scanned items nervously. A sign read, "Limit 1 case water per customer," on the mounted TV. The news showed people boarding up windows, a coastal road under a black sky. Back at the truck, David wiped his face with the cold towel skin burning like he'd leaned over an oven. The pump clicked to full. He capped it, patting the side of the truck. In the cab, AC cooled them both. For a moment they sat still, listening to their breathing settle.
Send our location to Aunt Karen, and Valdez too in case we need a trace.
Done.
A single fat raindrop smacked the windshield, burst, and was gone. The sky held its breath. David watched the storm edge moving in a Sharpie line across the horizon. He thought of Claymore at 17, standing on the wooden porch, wind tearing across the fields, Frank pressing a hammer into his palm, pointing at fence posts, saying nothing. He'd hated the silence, the way feelings got buried under work. When Martha died, that silence became a wall. Not now. The road came first. He checked mirrors, hit the signal, merged back into the flow leaving the city. Road signs blinked, closing early for storm. See you after Felicity. Kids in a minivan ahead pressed their faces to the glass. Pointing upward, sparrows darted low, skimming car roofs like sparks.
Think Grandpa will be happy to see us.
Men like him don't say happy or sad. He'll just look and nod. That's hello.
I don't remember much about him. Just that he stared off like he was hearing music nobody else could.
In Claymore, the wind's the music. It tells you before the rain, before the storm, he hears it.
David realized it was one of the few gentle things he'd said about his father in years. He went quiet. So did Ethan, as if afraid to break something fragile. A line of police cruisers sped past, lights flashing. The truck's radio caught a public safety alert. If you're in a low-lying area, leave now. Don't wait for rain. Plan your route. Stay calm. Streetlights came on early, the city trying to push back the dark. The sky shifted from steel to bruised purple. A few more raindrops fell, then stopped. David swerved around a trash bin rolling into the road. In his mirror, he saw a man carrying a sandbag, a boy pushing behind. It pulled up a memory, Ethan Small, running through Claymore's backyard, chasing a firefly. The phone buzzed. Frank, David answered on speaker.
Wind's changing. Claymore's still dry. If you're coming, come now. Stay off Creekside low ground.
Got it.
Bring water. I've got oil lamps. Boards are in the shed. Ethan there.
Hi, Grandpa.
Yeah.
3 seconds of silence, heavy with everything unsaid. Wind hissed through the phone.
Park under the porch, not under the oak. That's it.
Okay.
The call cut sharp. David's mouth twitched, half smile, half press. That was Frank brief, precise, cold as a topo map.
At least he called.
Yeah.
Before leaving the city's edge, David swung into a small grocery. Half the lot was empty, half crammed, inside. The bread aisle was picked over, water nearly gone, peanut butter untouched. He grabbed a power bank, nylon rope, duct tape. Ethan came up with a pack of Uno cards.
If the power's out, we'll need something to do.
Take it.
The cashier barely looked up from the TV, a reporter on the coast, talking about rapid pressure drop as wind whipped her hair. David paid, told Ethan to stay close, and they leaned into the door against the wind. Back on the road, the storm's shadow covered half the city. Behind them, Houston exhaled through smokestacks and glass towers. Ahead, the road stretched brown and flat toward the quiet before the storm. David's shoulders eased slightly once they cleared the traffic. He glanced at Ethan, not a boy anymore, focused on the map. Brow furrowed. That was his tell when he worried. He went silent.
Text him we'll be there by sunset.
Sent. He replied, yeah.
They both chuckled. The sound, small as it was, loosened the air. David turned the radio to an old country station, a raspy voice singing about dirt roads and beat-up trucks. In that steady guitar, he ran through Claymore's to-do list, board windows, fill the tub, set oil lamps, check radio batteries, clear the yard, tie the trash cans, drop the antenna. Frank had the tools. They'd work in silence, same as always. He pushed thoughts of his mother to the edges, like a dark smudge on the glass. Not now. Now was the road, the wind, the choice to leave before it was too late. The highway trees thinned. A sign read, "Leaving metropolitan area." The heavy sky closed in. David pressed the gas, listening to the engine's steady promise not to fail him. He squinted toward a brighter patch of sky, just a gap between storm bands. Beside him, Ethan cinched his seatbelt tighter. Both leaned forward, ready for the stretch that would take them back, not just to Claymore, but to stories left shut, not locked. Houston shrank into dim gold specks under the steel clouds. Rain speckled the windshield, then stopped. David flicked the wipers once, like clearing his throat. He shifted gears, leaning in, eyes locked on the road. Ethan did the same. 2 generations in the same posture, bracing for a road that would take them to face, storm or man, whatever waited at the end. And so, on a sweltering Texas afternoon, turning to a wind-heavy evening, with a choice, both ordinary and not. Chapter 1 began with the hum of an engine, the smell of gas and hot asphalt, a long road ahead, and a quiet promise that at the end, whether it was the storm or the man, they'd have to meet it head-on. The highway out of the metro narrowed to a pale grey strip, flanked by endless fields of sunburned grass. The wind blew harder now, carrying the scent of dry earth and the faint tang of rust from barbed wire fences running alongside the road. In the passenger seat, Ethan propped his chin on one hand, scrolling the map on his phone with the other, eyes fixed on the narrow, twisting lines that would take them toward Claymore.
If we take FM 517, then cut over to County Road 12, we can skip the closed section of I-45. But this road runs right by a big canal if the rain's heavy. It could flood.
We'll get there before the worst of it. Claymore's on high ground, harder to flood.
Ethan nodded slightly, though his gaze never left the screen. Every so often, he glanced at his father, as if wanting to ask something more, but swallowed it down. Finally. He leaned back, looking out the window where the sparse trees blurred by.
I've only met Grandpa a few times, maybe 10 hours of talking. Total.
Yeah,
Why's that?
David kept his eyes on the road, hands tightening on the wheel. He could feel his son waiting for an answer, but the question stirred up a mess of memories and feelings he didn't want to dig into, especially not on this long drive, and not with a storm on their heels.
that's a long story.
I don't mind hearing it. We've got hours.
Ethan, now's not the time.
Ethan let it go, though the silence felt heavier than an argument. He turned back to the pasture outside, where a small herd of cattle huddled under a live oak, their manes rippling in the wind. On the radio, an old country song drifted in, the steel guitar stretching every second. David let it play, hoping the melody would fill the space between them. But minutes later, the DJ's voice cut in again with another storm warning, reporting more coastal roads now fully shut down.
Dad. Grandpa used to chase storms. Right, Aunt Karen told me.
Yeah, back in the day, that's how he learned to handle himself when they hit.
Ethan turned to him, curiosity still bright.
Was it a storm that took Grandma?
David said nothing. A sudden gust slapped the truck, making it shudder. He gripped the wheel tighter, staring straight ahead, pretending the question had been carried off by the wind.
Check the map. County Road 12 have any blockades?
Ethan knew his dad was dodging him, but didn't push. He tapped his phone a few times before answering quietly.
No, nothing posted yet.
They drove on, winding through narrow country roads. Afternoon light sharpened into a harsh gold, while grey clouds gathered thick along the horizon. A wall ready to collapse. A leaning wooden sign by the roadside read, Claymore, 28 miles, its rusted screws pulling loose from the post. Inside the cab, the steady hum of the AC couldn't quite drown out the hiss of wind threading through the door seams. Ethan tugged his seatbelt one notch tighter, eyes still fixed outside on the road, carrying them closer to Frank. And to answers, David wasn't ready to give. The dirt road into Claymore was narrow and jarring, flanked by fields of brittle grass and low shrubs, all leaning in the wind's direction. Here and there, lonely wooden houses appeared, only to vanish again behind sagging barbed wire fences. Rounding a bend, Ethan spotted a faded mobile home standing solitary on a wide patch of land, its tin roof mottled with rust. Plywood already covering half the windows. Beside it sat an old pickup, paint peeling, parked tight against a listing wooden fence.
Haven't seen Grandpa's place in a long time.
Yeah, not since you were 10.
As the truck slowed, the mobile home's door swung open. Frank stepped out onto the porch, tall but slightly stooped, hair nearly all silver, wearing a worn denim shirt and scuffed cowboy boots. His eyes narrowed against the wind, one gloved hand gripping a hammer. David cut the engine and stepped down. He gave a small nod, half greeting, half distance. Frank returned it in kind, then his gaze shifted to Ethan.
You made it just in time. Wind's gonna pick up fast.
Main road's blocked. This was the only way through.
Yeah.
Ethan climbed out from the passenger seat, shutting the door and hesitating at the foot of the porch. Frank studied him for a few seconds, then his mouth tilted faintly.
You've grown. Last time I saw you, you weren't taller than the kitchen counter.
I can drive now.
In Texas, storms are just part of life. Come on in.
David popped the truck bed and hauled out a case of water and a few bags. Frank set the hammer against the wall, came down the 3 steps, and took a bag from his son without a word. Their eyes met for a moment, but neither held the glance longer than a heartbeat. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and machine oil. Black and white photographs and a few yellowed weather maps lined the walls. Ethan moved slowly, letting his gaze wander, until it stopped on a small framed picture on the shelf, a brown-haired woman with a gentle smile, standing between 2 young men.
Grandma, I remember she used to bake apple pies.
Ethan brushed a fingertip over Martha's face in the photo, as if afraid to smudge the smile. In his memory, the scent of pie mingled with Frank's low chuckle from the porch on a far-off autumn afternoon.
Ethan, put the bags down first.
David's voice cut in, a bit sharper than needed. Frank's eyes flickered briefly, then he turned back toward the window to check the locks. Outside, the wind had started to howl harder, as if urging them all to brace for a long night ahead. The wind had started to carry moisture now, no longer dry and hot like at midday. From the kitchen window, the low branches brushing the roof shook without pause, as if testing their strength before the storm truly arrived. Frank leaned in the doorway, eyes on the sky gone dull and leaden, a long plank of wood balanced across his shoulder.
David, help me get these out to the porch.
Yeah.
They circled around to the front. Ethan trailed them, hands in his pockets, eyes darting over every detail as if trying to memorize the place. Frank's mobile home was small but sturdy, braced with steel beams sunk deep into the ground. The soil around it had been cleared bare, save for a few low potted plants tucked against the porch. Frank set the plank down on the porch floor and wiped his forehead with the back of his glove.
Grab the drill and a box of screws from the green bin by the bench.
Ethan moved quickly, crouching to pull open a plastic bin that gave off the scent of metal and grease.
This one?
Yeah, bring it here.
Frank took it, then pointed to the right-hand window. David pressed the board tight against the frame, while Frank set the drill bit in place. The tool roared to life, the screw biting into the wood with a gritty squeal. Ethan watched each movement closely, automatically passing a fresh screw the moment Frank pulled the bit back. They moved on to the next window. This time, Ethan rolled up his sleeves and took one end of the board with his dad, under his t-shirt. The muscle in his arm tensed. But he didn't complain. Gusts swept across the porch, whipping his hair into his eyes.
Heavy, you do all this yourself, Grandpa?
Every storm season, good pine, sealed against moisture, lasts for years.
Dad, you ever do this at our place?
Not in the city. Apartment's different.
David's reply was short, but his voice had a weight to it. Ethan glanced over and saw his father focused on keeping the board steady while Frank drilled. Once the front windows were covered, they moved to the side of the house. A small window there was still open. Frank paused, scanning the frame as if checking something only he could see.
Frame's soft here, needs to be tighter. David, hold firm.
David braced the board with his shoulder, one hand on the edge, the other steadying the frame. Frank drilled slower this time. The screw bit into the softened wood with a creak. Ethan stood close behind, ready with another screw. No one spoke, just the drill, the wind, and the sound of wood being forced into place. After nearly half an hour, every window was boarded. All 3 were breathing heavier, sweat dotting their foreheads. Frank peeled off his gloves and leaned on the porch rail for a moment, eyes on the bare stretch of land out front.
Water next. Ethan, fill the bathtub. Let it run full.
Okay.
Ethan hurried inside, sneakers thudding on the wooden floor. He turned on the tap, the rush of water echoing through the small bathroom. At first, it ran cold, then warmed as the pipes cleared. He watched the surface swirl, imagining a blackout and the three of them using this water to wash, flush, maybe even cook if they had to. In the kitchen, David was opening cupboards, checking their drinking water supply. Frank lined gallon jugs on the counter, weighing whether it would be enough.
12 gallons. With the tub, we should be good.
Not if the storm's stronger than forecast, but it'll do for now.
Ethan came back, wiping his hands on his jeans. He spotted a few flashlights on the shelf and tested each. One flickered dimmer than the rest.
This one's weak.
Spare batteries are in the drawer by the sink.
Ethan dug out a pack of AA batteries and swapped them in at the table. When he clicked it on again, the beam cut clean through the kitchen, catching specks of dust drifting in the light. David gathered candles, matches, and a lighter into a small tin tray. He checked the portable generator in the corner, pulling the cord to let the engine run for a few seconds before shutting it off to save fuel.
How much spare gas?
2 full cans in the shed.
Ethan looked around the kitchen, feeling like he'd stepped into a small outpost before a mission. Everything here had a purpose: oil lamps on the shelf, a battery radio on top of the fridge, a toolbox under the table. His grandfather seemed like someone who'd lived his whole life in preparation, not just for storms, but for anything that could come.
How long you been doing this?
Since I was your dad's age, in Texas. Not being ready means asking for trouble.
Frank said it as if it were the simplest fact in the world, but David's eyes flicked over with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. David picked up the flashlight again, switched it on and off, then set it back down. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks in the boarded windows, a low, steady note. The roof popped once as a stronger gust rolled over it. Ethan moved to the door and tested the lock.
This one's good.
All right, let's eat before the power's out.
They had slices of bread spread with peanut butter, eaten quickly at the kitchen table. Ethan chewed slowly, his eyes drawn to the only uncovered window, its grey curtain shifting in the breeze. David drank a swallow of water, setting the bottle down to listen to the wind pressing closer by the minute. The meal was over in minutes. Frank pushed his chair back and rolled up his sleeves.
Time to check the shed. Ethan, with me.
Ethan got up right away, wiping his hands on a dish towel, ready to follow his grandfather out to the small wooden shed by the fence. As he stepped outside, it felt like crossing into a different world, cooler, darker, and heavy with the scent of incoming rain. The back door creaked long and low, like it hadn't been opened to its full swing in years. A rush of cool air swept in, carrying the scent of damp weeds and rusted metal. Ethan followed close behind Frank, stepping down 3 wooden steps, his canvas shoes crunching on the damp ground. The shed sat in the far corner of the yard, its wood siding weathered to grey. The tin roof streaked with pale scratches. Frank unlocked a rusted padlock with an old iron key, and the door swung open to a narrow, dim space thick with the smell of machine oil and damp wood. A faint shaft of daylight slipped in through a gap in the roof, cutting across piles of clutter toolboxes, coils of rope, plastic buckets, gas cans, and a stack of spare plywood.
Watch your step. It's a mess in here.
Okay.
David came in last, sweeping a flashlight beam around the space. The white light caught on the gleam of a saw blade, the polished tip of a drill bit. Outside, the wind funneled through the door, mixing with the rattle of the tin roof like a distant warning drum. Frank bent to pull a few folded blue tarps from a corner, shaking off the dust before rolling them tight. David checked a small portable generator in the corner, unscrewed the gas cap for a quick sniff, then nodded in approval.
Tank's full.
Good.
Ethan wandered, fingertips brushing over old, battered objects as if reading their history in the scratches and dust, on a tall shelf against the wall. He spotted a small wooden box darkened with age, corners rounded smooth, its lock rusted but not latched.
What's this, Grandpa?
Just keepsakes.
He lifted it down, a thin cloud of dust rising, making him wrinkle his nose. The box was heavier than he expected, as though it held more than just papers. When he opened it, the hinges groaned, releasing the scent of aged wood and yellowed paper. Inside, a silver pocket watch rested in one corner, its glass face dulled, chain coiled in a loose loop. Beside it lay a cream-colored handkerchief, the initials MH stitched in pale blue thread along the edge. But what made Ethan pause was the small stack of photographs at the bottom. He pulled the top one free. The image stopped his heart for a beat, a young woman with brown hair and a bright smile, Martha. Beside her stood a younger Frank and a lanky teenage David, eyes cast slightly away from the camera. Behind them, a red pickup, and above it a sky thick with churning storm clouds. Ethan swallowed, in his hazy memories. Grandma Martha was always tied to the scent of apple pie and quiet afternoons, never to the heavy, storm-charged air frozen in this photograph.
Dad.
He turned to look for David, but his father was crouched over the generator, cinching a strap tight, eyes fixed on his task. Frank stood nearby, a roll of tarp under one arm, glancing over briefly but saying nothing. Ethan looked back at the picture, feeling as if he'd just opened a door into a past where Martha's smile wasn't the only thing waiting to be remembered. Out in the yard, the wind suddenly shifted, lashing sideways across the tin roof with a long, taut hum, like a string pulled too tight. Daylight thinned, the sky dropping low and heavy, swallowing the tree line into a single dark mass. Ethan stepped out of the shed with the wooden box tucked under his arm. The photograph pinched between his fingers. The air now carried the metallic tang of coming rain, damp, sharp, and almost salty on the tongue, and almost. David was kneeling by the generator, tying a gas can to its frame. Sweat rolled down his temple, disappearing into his stubble. He looked up when he saw the box in his son's arms.
Dad, I found this.
The photograph caught a thin knife of light under the grey sky. David's eyes landed on Martha's face, then darted away, as if the paper had burned him.
Put it back, Ethan.
I've never seen this one. She's smiling different than in the pictures in the living room.
Not now.
David's voice was low and flat. Something held tightly underneath. A gust slammed into the porch, banging the back door against the wall with a dry crack, making all three of them freeze.
Bolt it.
Ethan shoved the door closed and dropped the metal latch. When he turned, the photo was still pressed to his chest, his eyes on his father, who stood brushing dirt from his knees.
I just want to know, where was this taken?
Ethan.
Just 2 syllables, cold and heavy. David snatched a tarp from the table's edge and strode to the porch as if the work had just become twice as urgent. The metal hooks on the tarp clinked together in his hands. Ethan watched him go, his throat dry. Frank was just behind him, a roll of tarp under one arm, neither stepping forward nor back. His aged eyes rested briefly on the photo on his late wife's face, then slid away.
Still plenty to tie down out here.
His words were quiet and even. Like wind moving through trees, David nodded without looking back. Ethan slipped the photo into the box, shut the lid, and tucked it into the pocket of the denim jacket, hanging on the porch hook before heading for the gutters. The wind pushed against him, wet and cold, the scent of earth turning sharp. Frank braced a hand on the porch rail, checking the screws in the boards they'd just set. He rattled the frame once, listening to the deep creak of wood and metal holding together.
Good enough.
David dragged a tarp over the old pickup. The wind billowed it like a sail. Ethan lunged to catch a corner, the two of them gripping opposite ends of the blue sheet, holding on as if to keep a thrashing fish from slipping away.
I've got it, tie it, Dad.
Pull it lower. That's it. Tight.
Knots cinched. The tarp clung to the truck in the taut rhythm of their work. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment. Something almost surfaced, then the wind slipped between and carried it off. As the next gust hit, stronger still, they stepped back under the porch. To the west, the sky shifted from grey to iron black. Thunder hadn't spoken yet, but it felt as if it were holding its breath. Ethan pulled the denim jacket closer, the box still inside. He almost said more, then stopped. The air on the porch was thick, salted somehow. David leaned against a post, breathing deep.
Dad, I'm not asking about all of it, just the picture. I want to know what that day was like.
It was a day with a storm.
I can see that.
And like any other storm day, people got ready, tied things down, boarded windows, and waited for it to pass. That's it.
Ethan bit his lip and turned to Frank. His grandfather didn't look away, but he didn't offer words either.
Inside, check the flashlights and radio batteries. Wind's up.
Inside, the light seemed to dim a shade. The kitchen lamp flicked on, pale gold, throwing long shadows across the floor. David gathered candles to the center of the table, breaking leftover wax into pieces for easier lighting. Ethan set the box on a cabinet far enough from his father's reach, but still in sight. The battery radio crackled to life, a deep voice reading coordinates and naming Claymore among the towns with rising wind speeds. Ethan listened while sorting batteries, setting the used ones aside.
Radio says rain in about an hour.
Yeah.
David slipped a lighter into his pocket and handed Ethan the brightest flashlight. When their hands met, Ethan noticed his father's palm was cold.
I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable.
You didn't. It's just some things don't help when the storm's this close.
Frank set a pot of water on the stove, letting it simmer. He dropped in a bag of black tea, and the scent spread bitter, warm.
Drink something hot. Then shut the stove off before the power flickers.
Ethan sipped, then set the mug down and pulled the box closer, opening the lid just enough to see Martha's smile again, her hair lifting in the wind.
Grandpa, was she happy that day?
Your grandma always smiled when the rain was coming.
David tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, not quite agreeing, not quite denying. Outside, a metal sign tore free of its post and clattered against the fence. David rushed out to catch it, Frank tossing him a rope, Ethan following to help secure it.
In wind.
Keep it inside against the wall.
They shut the door again, the wind slapping a handful of dry leaves onto the porch. Ethan leaned on the frame, staring out at a sky that had lost its last trace of blue.
Dad, after the storm, can we talk again?
Yeah.
A small promise dropped between gusts so light it nearly blew away. Frank sniffed once, then placed the radio closer to the table, like a soldier keeping his weapon within reach. The light flickered twice. Frank said it calmly.
It always does that right before it goes out for real.
Ethan arranged the flashlights, candles, and matches within easy reach. His eyes drifted to the cabinet where the box now sat. The storm hadn't hit yet, but it felt as if another one from inside was getting ready to break. The wind had changed its voice, no longer the single gusts of the afternoon, but a long, low, heavy breath, like some giant beast circling the house, branches slapped against the tin siding with a rhythmless persistence, like someone knocking without mercy. In the small living room, an oil lamp glowed dimly on the table, its warm gold light sending a thin coil of smoke toward the low ceiling, the shadows of Frank, David, and Ethan stretched long on the walls, wavering with each flicker of the flame. Frank sat in a grey upholstered armchair, an old wool blanket draped over his legs. David sat angled off to the side, back straight, eyes fixed on the window boarded over with plywood. Ethan sat closest to the table, hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea, glancing now and then toward the front door, where the wind seemed to be looking for a way in. A heavy thump on the roof made Ethan flinch. Frank tilted his head, listening, before saying quietly,
"Just a branch, not the boards."
The oil lamp's flames swayed gently. Frank cleared his throat and, as if to shake off the tension, began to talk.
"When your dad was little, once, a storm knocked the power out for 3 days. We lived off a crate of canned fish and a single candle. Your dad back then insisted on keeping it lit all night. Said it was to scare off storm ghosts."
Ethan smiled at the image of his father as a boy. David didn't speak, only took a sip of water, his gaze still on the door.
You really believed in storm ghosts, Dad?
Back then, I believed in more things than that.
Frank's voice blended with the wind as he went on.
"Another time. We had to sleep in Old Man Thomas's storm cellar next door. Wind howling over our heads. The ground like ice underneath. But that kid still slept sound, holding on to some ragged old teddy bear."
What happened to it, Dad?
Don't remember, might have been lost in a move.
The wind slammed harder into the siding, making the whole house tremble. Ethan pulled his feet closer to the chair, eyes on his grandfather, waiting for more. But Frank only sipped his tea, his gaze softening. Ethan realized that since he'd started talking, Frank hadn't once mentioned Martha in his storm memories. It was only him and David, any other presence replaced by silence.
Got any more stories, Grandpa?
"Plenty, but some are for another time."
Rain began to fall, first scattered, then hammering down. The tin roof roared like a battle drum. In the glow of the oil lamp, 3 generations sat together, bound by unspoken silences, with the wind's howl and the rain's assault weaving through the space between them. The rain had shifted to a deeper register, heavy and dense, as if someone were dumping buckets straight onto the roof. Wind whistled through the narrow seams between the boarded windows, a long, drawn-out note that trilled before choking off. The oil lamp trembled slightly, their 3 shadows quivering on the wall like paper cutouts in a draft. Ethan set his mug down, glancing toward the cabinet where he'd hidden the wooden box. The image from that afternoon had been etched in his mind all evening, so vivid it felt as though it were resting in his palm. He turned to Frank, drawing a long breath.
Grandpa, so, about the photo from earlier, the one with Grandma between you and Dad, what kind of day was that?
David lifted his head slightly but didn't cut in. Frank stayed silent for a few beats, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. Outside, a sudden gust struck the siding, making the tin walls shudder.
"That was the last day we were all together."
Ethan swallowed hard. The lamplight caught his grandfather's eyes, deepening the lines at their corners like paths leading back into some far-off memory.
"Back then, your grandma and I had this habit, storm chasing. Not to be reckless, but to watch the clouds, listen to the wind, see the storm while it was still on the horizon. She always said the clouds before a storm were like great paintings, each one different.
He paused, gaze fixed on the empty space above the table as if seeing it again.
That day, the forecast said the storm would hit the next town over, not here. We took the red pickup out to the open fields, brought the camera. David, he was still growing then, came along grudgingly.
David's hand tightened slightly, but he didn't speak. Frank went on.
By the time that picture was taken, the clouds had started to spin. The wind was picking up faster than the forecast said. We decided to head back, but minutes later, a gust dropped a power pole across the road. I had to take the back way. The rain came in like a wall.
Outside, on the porch, the real rain seemed to thicken, folding into the story.
She wanted to stop for just a few more shots, said it would take seconds. I was worried, told her to get in the truck, but she stepped out anyway. And then
His knotted hands clenched tighter.
a gust hit, knocked her down. She slid into the drainage ditch. I ran to her, but the water rose fast, pulled her under, all of it, in less than a minute.
The room seemed to shrink. Ethan sat frozen, his heartbeat loud enough to drown out the storm. David took a slow breath, then spoke, his voice unlike before, sharper, harder.
That's not how I remember it, Frank.
Frank looked up, meeting his son's eyes. Outside, thunder rolled for the first time, announcing the stronger winds still on their way. Thunder rolled in a long, low note, rattling through the beams as if the sky itself were knocking on the frame of the house. The oil lamp wavered, its gold light cutting across Frank and David's faces, tracing every vein and tight line.
You tell it like everything was out of your hands, but I remember it differently.
How?
I remember she wasn't in the ditch yet. I remember you leaving her there to run back to the truck.
Ethan's gaze darted from his father to his grandfather. The air in the room felt so thick it held his breath in place. Frank sat still, his eyes sliding off David and down to the floor, one hand on his knee, trembling faintly.
Dad?
I've told you before, Ethan, that day, the storm didn't take her right away. She called for him, and he turned his back.
Outside, the wind slammed against the boarded windows, nails squealing in the wood as if something were trying to pry the planks loose. Frank swallowed, the movement of his throat slow, deliberate.
You don't know the whole story.
I know enough not to forget.
The lamp flickered, their shadows stretching, twisting across the wall. Ethan felt caught between two storms, one outside, with wind and rain, the other a long sleeping fury roused inside these walls.
You too, Grandma?
She might still be alive if in that moment you hadn't put yourself first.
Frank closed his eyes briefly, breathing in deep. When he opened them, there was no defense, no argument, only his gaze fixed on the tile floor, where the lamp's glow pooled faint and uneven. Outside, a heavy crash shook the walls. The tin roof rattled without pause, and Ethan realized the gale beyond these walls felt easier to bear than the silence inside. David rose, walking to the window, his back turned to them. Frank stayed seated, eyes still lowered. His broad shoulders weighted as if carrying the whole house and the storm pressing against it. Ethan looked between them and felt as though a deep crack had split the floor, dividing the family into two banks. The oil lamp quivered in the draught, seeping through the doorframe. Ethan heard his own heartbeat, the lash of rain, and the silence so dense it felt ready to shatter. The wind screamed like a freight train loaded with steel barreling past the house. Rain hammered the tin roof, spraying in white streaks through the cracks around the door. The oil lamp flickered wildly, their shadows jerking up and down as if caught in the wind's grip. A sharp crack rang from the north wall, then bang, a window board tore loose, leaving a gaping black square to the raging night. A blast of cold wind and rain punched into the room.
The window.
Hold it.
All three lunged toward it. David and Frank slammed the board back against the frame, but the wind shoved back with a force that felt like it could swallow the whole room. Ethan grabbed for the length of rope to keep it from slipping, rain stinging his face like needles. A high, piercing shriek cut through the darkness. Ethan turned just in time to see another loose board from outside, spinning through the air like a massive blade, aimed straight for the open frame. Before he could react, Frank twisted around, throwing his body in front of him. The board struck hard against the back of Frank's denim jacket, then clattered to the floor, sliding away through the puddling rainwater.
Grandpa.
I'm fine. Hold the window.
David's eyes flashed, and he dove in to take Frank's place. Driving his shoulder into the board, the wind pressed back so hard the wooden studs groaned. Frank wiped rain from his face and stepped in to help. The three of them moved together, their breathing locked in rhythm with the storm's roar outside.
Rope, Ethan, now.
Got it.
He threaded the rope through the latch, his fingers shaking from the cold. David yanked the knot tight, Frank bracing the other end, pulling hard and looping it around the metal frame. When the last knot cinched, the wind still screamed, but the board held steady. They staggered back, gasping for breath. Rain still slashed through the gap, but no longer poured in. For a moment, Ethan looked at his grandfather, his denim jacket soaked dark. A few streaks of red blooming on his arm where splintered wood had grazed him. Frank only gave him a small nod. The kind that said, "I'm fine," without a word. The wind outside didn't let up. It still circled the house, lashing walls, roof, and every crack as if testing the strength of every plank. But inside the small room, a new kind of silence had formed, not because the storm had eased, but because something else had shifted. David stayed by the window frame, one hand resting on the newly secured board, feeling each vibration as the wind pounded against it. Behind him, the oil lamp threw the shadows of him and Frank onto the wall, two large silhouettes side by side, shuddering not just from the wind, but from the rhythm of their heavy breathing. He glanced at his father. Frank had stepped back slightly, one hand gripping the sleeve of his denim jacket where the wood had torn it. Rain still ran down his temple, matting silver hair against his forehead, and even in the sting of pain, Frank wore the faintest smile, aimed at Ethan. That smile made David pause. For years, the father in his memory was nothing but cold, stubborn, and on that storm day long ago, the man who left his mother behind. But just now, Frank hadn't hesitated for even a second to shield Ethan, not out of some distant instinct, but with the readiness of a man willing to take the hit himself, no matter the cost. A rush of memories came back, not of the day they lost her, but of rare moments from childhood, his father carrying him across flooded streets, wrapping him in blankets during winter blackouts, memories he'd long shoved aside, buried under the thick dust of resentment. Now, in one act, some of that dust had been blown away.
Dad, Grandpa's hurt.
He's fine, just a scratch.
David said it, but his eyes never left Frank. The wind gave another sharp shove, rattling the house, but this time what felt most unsteady to David wasn't the frame or the roof, it was the certainty he'd held on to for so long. Frank didn't look back at his son. He bent to pick up a coil of rope that had slipped from his hand, turned, and tied it to a shelf to keep it from being swept away. The lamplight outlined his broad shoulders, now slightly stooped with age, but still solid. Over the rain and the wind, David suddenly heard his mother's voice, how she used to say, "Your father doesn't know how to say he loves you, but he'll show you in what he does." He'd never believed it until now. Ethan's gaze stayed fixed on his grandfather, eyes wide with a mix of worry and awe. David caught that look and knew his son had just witnessed something. It took him an entire youth to forget that Frank, for all his mistakes, was still a man who never hesitated to protect his family. The wind outside still howled in long, dragging gusts. But the room felt steadier now with the window reinforced. Rain kept lashing against the boards, leaving shimmering streaks across the freshly nailed wood. The air inside was thick with the scent of rain, wet timber, and the faint oil smell from the flickering lamp. David let go of the board and stepped back, feeling the rush of his heartbeat still pounding in his chest. He turned, his eyes immediately finding Frank. The old man had settled onto the edge of the armchair, back slightly hunched, one hand resting on his thigh while the other pressed over the torn denim on his left sleeve where the wood had scraped him. His breaths were deep and heavy, each inhale making his collarbone tremble.
Grandpa, does it hurt a lot?
I'm fine. Just a scratch. I've had worse.
Frank's mouth curved into a thin smile, not the forced kind meant to reassure, but the kind tempered by years of endurance. Steady, yet gentle. It was aimed at Ethan, but David saw it too, and for a moment it felt like it touched the ice he'd been keeping in his chest for years. David stood still, saying nothing, just watching his father and his son. He noticed how Ethan leaned slightly toward Frank, his eyes bright in the lamplight, carrying a trust without hesitation, a simple image, but one that made David realize the storm outside could tear the roof right off. But as long as moments like this remained, the family hadn't lost everything. The wind slammed against the walls again, but this time none of them flinched. The oil lamps swayed softly, casting their shadows on the wall, three shapes now standing closer together. No one spoke, but the silence was no longer the thick, brittle kind of Chapter 3. It had shifted into a silence filled with words unspoken, but no longer blocked by anger. Ethan picked up his cooled tea, holding what little warmth was left between both hands. He glanced from his father to his grandfather, then lowered his eyes with the faintest smile. Deep inside, he felt certain that in the middle of this storm, something had just been mended. David moved toward the table, pulling his chair closer to Frank's. He didn't say thank you, and he didn't apologize, but he nudged the old wool blanket toward his father, a small gesture, enough for Frank to understand. Outside, the storm kept roaring. Inside, the oil lamp burned steadier, wrapping all three of them in its warm glow. No words were needed, but both Ethan and David could feel it. Something in their relationship had shifted. Morning light poured in through the gaps in the door like a stream of warmth, replacing the damp chill and the howling wind that had ruled the night. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, with a few lazy white clouds drifting as if no storm had ever passed. But when the three of them stepped outside, the truth lay in plain sight. The fields around them were torn apart, streaked with puddles that caught the sunlight. The wooden fence to the east had been knocked flat by the wind, its posts and rails scattered like the ribs of some giant animal. Across the ground, broken branches, fallen leaves, and splintered boards were strewn everywhere. Frank took a deep breath, said nothing, and stepped off the porch. His rubber boots sank into the mud with a wet squelch. David followed, bending to set upright a trash bin that had rolled into the yard. Ethan ran to the fence line, picking up stray pieces of wood and stacking them into a neat pile.
It's like the whole field got turned upside down.
Yeah, but the grass will grow back. It always does.
The morning breeze carried the earthy, damp scent of mud mixed with the sharp tang of freshly broken wood. In the distance, a few neighbors stepped outside, waving across the empty space where the fences used to stand. David lifted a metal sign from the weeds, knocking off the caked mud. Frank pulled a tarp from the pickup and checked that the frame was still intact. Ethan brought over a bundle of rope that could still be used and set it on the hood.
At least the truck's okay.
Yeah, luckier than a lot of folks.
They worked to the sound of boots in the mud, wood clattering together, and birds returning to the bare branches. Each was busy in their own corner, but every so often they glanced toward one another just to be sure that after the long night, everyone was still here, still whole. The sun climbed higher, spilling warm golden light over the battered field. The sharp clink of metal rang out as David and Frank wound steel wire around the post of a newly set fence. The morning breeze was gentle, but in both their chests lingered the weight of the storm's long night.
Dad, about that day, I want to hear it all, from you, every detail.
Frank tightened the loop of wire, his gaze fixed on his weathered hands, as if searching for the right words in the grain of the old wood.
That day, the storm shifted faster than anyone predicted. Your mother wanted to take a few more shots, said it would only take a minute. I told her no, but you know her. She was never afraid of the wind.
He swallowed hard before continuing.
When she stepped down into the ditch, a metal sign ripped loose in the wind and came flying straight toward you. You were only a few feet away, and I had to choose. If I'd run to your mother in that moment, that sign would have cut right through you.
David froze, the wire in his hands going slack.
I shoved you down behind the embankment, out of its path. But in those few seconds, just seconds, when I turned back, the water had already taken her. I jumped in, but the current was too strong. I didn't make it in time.
The dry twist of wire against the post filled the heavy silence. David looked at his father, his eyes carrying confusion, regret, and a grief that had just taken a new shape.
I never knew that.
I never told you. I thought, if you believed I left her, you'd be angry. But at least you wouldn't carry the weight of knowing I chose to save you instead of her. I didn't want that burden on you.
David drew in a deep breath, his chest heavy as if he'd just lifted a boulder.
But your silence made me think something even worse.
I know, and I'm sorry.
They finished winding the last loop of wire when the steel pulled tight against the post. David let go and looked at his father for a long moment.
Thank you for saving me, and I'm sorry for letting Ethan grow up thinking his grandfather was just a stranger.
And I'm sorry for letting you grow up without knowing the whole story.
They didn't embrace, but as they both released the wire, the distance between them measured in decades closed to a single step. The sun had fully risen above the horizon, its light streaming through the gaps in the broken fence, laying long streaks across the damp earth. The scents of mud, wet wood, and wind-torn leaves mingled in the air, drifting over the field. From the edge of the yard, Ethan came running back, both arms wrapped around a bundle of dry branches. He dropped them near where his father and grandfather were working, then stood still, his eyes shifting between the two men.
I think if we finish this fence before noon, we'll make it.
David glanced at Ethan, then at Frank. The two of them stood only a few paces apart, mud clinging to their pant legs, their breathing slowed after the morning's work. No more howling wind, no pounding rain, just the quiet between them and Ethan's expectant gaze. David drew a deep breath, then stepped forward. Frank straightened, his shoulders tightening as if bracing for a different kind of conversation. But instead of words, David extended his hand. For a moment, Frank hesitated, as though this simple gesture was the most unfamiliar thing between father and son. He looked at the calloused hand before him, then slowly reached out, clasping it. Frank's grip was warm, steady, still carrying the strength of a man who had spent his life working with his hands. David gave a firm squeeze, and in that squeeze there was no stiffness, only acknowledgement. Watching them, Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest. No apologies, no thanks were spoken, but he knew that everything that needed to be said was already in that handshake. The morning breeze stirred, lifting a few silver strands of hair from Frank's forehead. David released his hand with a small nod. Frank nodded back, then turned to heft the coil of steel wire onto his shoulder.
Come on, let's finish this fence and get some breakfast.
Okay.
The three of them returned to their work, their footsteps pressing into the damp ground, their shadows stretching long in the fresh sunlight. The storm outside had passed, and inside each of them, another storm had finally gone quiet. Thank you for listening to the story. If you have any thoughts, feel free to share them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Once again, I'm really happy to have you here. Don't forget to subscribe so we can keep sharing more stories about life together. Take care and see you next time.